Hey everyone, today we are going to review And of Clay Are We Created that we read on Monday. So, And of Clay Are We Created by Isabella Allende is a short story that includes magical realism, but it's not as obvious as the other short story we read, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. So, in And of Clay Are We Created, we see a short story in which a small town is covered by mud after a volcanic eruption. And this takes place in Latin America, like the other short story that we read. So, in And of Clay Are We Created, again, a small town is covered by mud after a volcanic eruption, and there are people who are stuck in the mud from the town. Um, Due to the enormity of the event and because of the disaster, there are news reporters and different people who come to the town to both help and to report on what's happening. One of our characters is Rolf Carley, and he comes to the town to try to help and report on what happened. And he ends up helping our main character, Azucena. And Rolf Carley and Azucena are both main characters. So, in the short story, Rolf tries various ways to try to help Azucena, and he tries to pull her out of the mud, but he cannot get her out of the mud, and she thinks, or Azucena thinks, it's because her brothers and sisters who are buried in the mud beneath her are pulling her down. And this is the magical realism in the text. Everything else is based on the real life event, except this one thing where Azucena believes that her brothers and sisters from the town, so the other people in the town, are physically grabbing her and pulling her down into the mud to die with them. And then at the end of the story, the character does die. So let's review what happens in the story. So, describe the event that occurs before the story begins. After a volcanic eruption, rivers of mud bury a town. What point of view is the story told in? Who is the narrator? The story is told in first person, and this may have not been obvious. You may have thought it was third person or one of the other main characters, but the narrator is the girlfriend or wife of Rolf Carley. So she's telling us in first person what happened to Rolf, what happened to Azucena, and what she tries to do to help. Describe Rolf Carley's efforts to save Azucena. He tries to pull her free. He struggles with poles and ropes. He puts a tire beneath her arms. He tries to remove rubble. He tries to get a pump. How does the narrator try to help Azucena? So, how does the girlfriend or wife try to help? She calls officials and asks for help on radio and television. And at the end of the story, what happens to Azucena? At the end of the story, she dies. So, determining an author's purpose. The three most common broad purposes of writing are to inform, so to tell your audience about an event or information, to persuade, to try to get your audience to believe something that you do, or to try to persuade them to do something, and to entertain. And to entertain is not necessarily to make someone laugh, but to create.
Please excuse interruption. I need Mr. Holstein,
Hold
Mr.
on.
Callahan, Mr. Smith, Ms. Gregory, Mr. Darren Mills, Ms. Casey. Please come to the cafeteria. Holstein, Callahan, Smith, Gregory, Mills, Ms. Casey.
But to entertain means to create an emotional connection. Allende took a real life event and fictionalized it into a short story. What was her purpose in writing this short story? So, the author's purpose is to inform the reader about the disaster and how big of a disaster it was, and to persuade the reader of its horror. So, she's trying to create an emotional connection and trying to get her reader to understand how much of a disaster it was and the feelings involved. By creating the character Azucena, the author is able to draw a more emotional connection for her audience because we see the horror of the disaster and how it affected those within the town. The use of magical realism in the short story pushes the audience to realize that what happened not only affected Azucena physically, but the event also affected other people who were living there and the people who loved those who died in the disaster. So let's look at our other reading check. What is the relationship between Rolf and Azucena? What do they give to each other, and what kind of love do they share? So the relationship between Rolf and Azucena is a rescuer and who is being rescued. Azucena talks about her fears, and Rolf Carley gives her encouragement, and through him trying to rescue her, they gain this connection in which they both discuss what's happened to him and both of their fears. And they share a love for humanity and a desire to help others. Consider Rolf's efforts to help Azucena and what happens to Rolf and Azucena at the end. Then, in a sentence or two, express what you think is the story's theme, its insight, or message about life. So, the theme or the message is that the world is full of horrors, but we still find ways to care for one another and value life while facing devastating losses. Despite the fact that Azucena was dying, Rolf Carley stayed with her and tried to help her through that loss. So even though bad things happen, we still try to encourage and to connect and to help those that are facing those losses and those disasters. Do you think most people would have behaved as Rolf Carley does? Explain why or why not. Most people would try to help, but many might become less involved, especially when they are scared of what might happen. And then compare and contrast Ellende's story with the newspaper account of the same events. Think about how the story is told. Which account do you find more moving and which do you find more informative? I find the short story more moving because of the descriptions and figurative language, as well as the characterization of both Rolf and Azucena. And then I think that the article is more informative because it's telling the audience about what happened, and it's very informative and very matter of fact. So this is a review of And of Clay Are We Created. It's different from A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. In A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, we learn about how humans use others for their own benefit and how wrong that is. And we see magical realism throughout the short story with the man who has wings and with the other characters, like the woman who turns into a spider and then the man that is like a bat. So we see magical realism throughout that short story. In this short story, the magical realism isn't as apparent, so it's not as obvious. In this short story, we learn about a real life event, how a volcano erupts, a town is buried in mud, and people try to rescue the people who are in the town. That doesn't seem illogical. It doesn't seem out of the blue or like there's magic. And that isn't. It's based on the real life event. The magic or the illogical scenario, so the scenario that doesn't make sense, is when Azucena is being pulled out of the mud. She can't get pulled out because the mud is like vacuuming her into the ground. And she believes that it's the other people in the town, so her brothers and sisters from the town, who are pulling her down. They don't want her to escape. They want to they want to get Azucena into the mud and for her to die along with them. So that is the magical realism in the short story. So there are two different ways that you can use magical realism in a story. One could be obvious and it happens throughout the story, and in another, it may be used on a smaller scale, and it still is effective because it's showing how emotional that scene is and how emotional the story is. If Azucena didn't feel as if her brothers and sisters were pulling her down into the mud, she would not feel the loss of everyone else in the town. So the magical realism in this short story emphasizes the loss that everyone experiences. So here is your review. If you have any other questions, just let me know.